Good morning. This is Drupal 8 integration with Slack. We'll be going over a Slack-based text adventure game. I am Jack Franks. I've been doing this now this year for 30 years. Wow. I've been working with Drupal since 2013, and I work for Breakthrough Technologies. I'm going to kind of rush through the who I am and what I do because this is a pretty long and dense presentation. There's a lot to go over. Mostly I stay in Drupal because I love working with all of you. Being in this community is one of my favorite things that I've done in my career. And like I said, I've been doing this for 30 years now. I consider myself mostly a back-end developer. That's what I enjoy the most. I can theme stuff, but I don't take any joy from it. So working with Slack was really fun because most of it's done on an API level, and I enjoyed that. As a youth, for a long time, I was a BBSer. I built my first modem when I was a little kid, learned how to solder on it, and then used it to dial out everywhere. I played a lot of games on multi-line bulletin boards. The Galaticomm major BBS system was my favorite. I actually ran one for a long time, and this was the first system that I had been on that allowed a massive amount of other users at the same time. So there were these text-based multi-user adventure games like like Zork, but 32 players could all play it at once and interact and solve puzzles together. And as a kid, I just had so much fun with it. As I was browsing around the internet one day, I found the source code for it, and that took me back in a really pleasant way. So I decided to port it, see if I could implement it in Drupal. I started out doing it with a WebSocket-based front end, and then figured out that I could actually integrate it with Slack, and then a whole bunch of people could all play it together. So the game I've ported is called Kyandia. This world, these authors actually went on to make a graphical computer game based on this world. But the original from 1989 is called Kyandia, and it was available strictly for this major BBS system. And as we can see, Dvorak's Guide to PC Telecommunications writes in 1990 that Kyandia is the most advanced multi-user text adventure game created to date. And now I have ported it into PHP and Drupal. So let's look at a quick demo. We're going to see what the app looks like, how the interactions work, the kind of data that Drupal serves up through Slack and what it looks like in Slack, how users can interact with each other, and then what the app actually looks like. So we have a couple of Slack windows up here. We have one player in a dark theme, one player in a light theme. We can say something over here, and then we see it over here. So I can move off to the north, and here it says that that I left. And then there's, here's the description of the room that we're now in. You can see what I'm carrying, which would be nothing. You can pick something up. Oh, something's broken. That's all right. I can come back into the room, and then it notifies me that I'm here. Gaining levels in this game is all puzzle based. It's not experience point based or killing monsters or anything. You have to solve these particular puzzles. So to get from level 1 to 2 in this room, you have to type Neil, and then here it gives me a description. Says I'm level 2. Here we can see that this player suddenly grows in strength and knowledge. We get a spell in our spell book. So this is how we interact with it. Sort of like in the old days with your modem. You sign on to your bulletin board, you join the game, and you start typing in commands, and then you get to interact with the system, and then it displays to the other players what it is that you're doing. Usually, I'm hosting this app on a free tier Pantheon dev site. Today, I'm using ngrok so that I can display it locally and make changes for everyone on the fly. We can see how some of this stuff works. There's some issues with some of that because in order to get the interactive components working, when you when you receive the message from Slack, you have to pass back an authentication token that allows the user to interact with the components. And that has to be all done within 3 seconds. And with the strain on the network, with everybody working from home nowadays, and I'm presenting and recording and running it again with ngrok here locally, most of the time these messages do not go back and forth fast enough. So I can show you some interactive components, but some of them aren't working because my connection is too slow right now. In normal life, it doesn't really matter because it's pretty fast, but again, today it might not work. The actual Slack app is just a normal Slack app. The URLs are set to that Dev Pantheon site or the ngrok ones today. And then I have a handful of new and custom modules that I've written in order to make this happen. There's one called Word Grammar, Slack Incoming. Those two are pretty broadly useful and available on Drupal.org. Then I've got the Slack Mud engine, which drives the game. The Kyandia engine, which has commands and handling for this particular game, because you can have multiple games running on the same engine. And then the migration module which handles all of the data import. So going over word grammar, this is a text-based game. So I needed to generate indefinite articles for all of the nouns, to build these text descriptions that I'm displaying everywhere. In order to do that, I needed to build out a little library to do it. So here's the example of how it works. And this is just random. There's no dependency injection here or anything, but it's just a service. So you can pass in a word, and then it gives you the indefinite article. So if I have apple, it gives me an. But if I have, oh, did I click? If I put in hour, it also knows to give me an. But if I go horse, it gives me a. And unique, even though it starts with a vowel, it needs a. So it handles all of the indefinite articles. And then I also needed nicely formatted word lists based on an array of words that I pass in. And then you have the option to build an Oxford comma at the end, but as we know, that should always be true because we should always embrace the Oxford comma. So if I get the word list with horse, dog, cat, chicken, and elephant, sorry, I think that I was moving my mouse and it clicked. So if we pass in this array, then it gives us horse, comma, space, dog, comma, space, and so on, and then ending with the and elephant. And it's smart enough to know that if there's only 2 items, it doesn't comma-ize them. And if there's 1, it doesn't use the and. The pieces of the old game that we're trying to bring in are the data and the code. In order to bring in the data, a lot of this is it's old format, old C code, old message files, and it's pretty strangely formatted text for the way that we're normally passing around data nowadays. But there's a bunch of kind of things that we need to bring in. So I needed text for all of the different locations and the items and the spells that you can cast, the descriptions for when things happen, the message text that when you do something, it tells you something, and then it also tells other people in the room something. The descriptions and progression for every one of the levels in the system. And then there's all the C code, which are all of the command routines for everything that you can type. So, I did an inventory, I picked something up, you can drop something, you can say something. Everything that you do to interact with the system has its own little command routine. And I ported all of that from the old C code into PHP. Each of the locations has special handling. So there, for instance, there's a couple of places in the game where you can dig for gold or treasure or whatever. But if you're in a place that doesn't allow you to dig for those, it handles it separately. And the 2 places where you can dig also handle it separately. So the locations need their own routines to handle that. And then there's the system interaction routines, like displaying messages to certain people. If you walk into a room, it needs to display to the people in the room that you're leaving that you left, and then into the room that you're arriving into that you've arrived. So there's all kinds of interaction stuff that that determine who gets what messages. So we're going to talk about importing all of this old data first. On the left, you can see what one of these command routine looks like. This is reading something. And you can see, you know, it's just old C code. I mean, pretty good old C code, but you know, it is old, and there's a lot of pointer stuff, and it handles statics differently. So you know, it's there was some work to bring it over. And then on the right here, you can see what one of the text messages looks like. So there's these big message text files just full of this stuff. We start out with this little identifier, this HLP MSG, with an open brace, and then a whole bunch of code, and some of them actually have, you know, kind of sophisticated ASCII art in them, which doesn't translate very well to a variably spaced font like we get in Slack. And then we can see that a few rows down, we get the closing brace, and then a T to indicate that there's some a title here, which is a Kyandia description. And here's another one. This is HLP COM, and it starts with this. If we look at another one, here's an actual level description record. It's a female description for level 4. And here it is. We have some sprintf tokens in here, and a description. So I needed a custom migration source that could parse all of this data. And that looks, well, kind of something like this. So we grab the contents from what our path is specified, which is the path to the data file. Then we start splitting out all of the line feeds, break those into actual line breaks, and then we have a little regex that splits that out. And then it walks through each of the rows, looks for the open brace, and then finds the next closed brace. And I know that I could do this with another regular expression, but these are the ones that take a little bit of time, and this only has to run once for every file for every game. So it wasn't super important to really optimize it. But we can see that it looks for the open brace, and then walks through each of the following lines until it finds the closing brace, breaks that down with the T there, so that we pull out this as our name, and this is our type, and this is our description. So here's name, description, and type. And then we add that into the row, add that into the rows array, and then we return an iterator based on that rows array. Now this is something I've been saying since I started doing Drupal 8 migration presentations, that you have to remember here to return an array iterator. If you return an array here, your source won't work, and it'll always return you 0 rows. The documentation actually just recently has been updated to reflect that, but if you start writing a custom migration source and your iterator always seems to return nothing, just make sure that you're returning an array iterator instead of just an array. Now, writing up that migration, it looks like this. So this is Kyandia messages. We're using the message plugin that we just went over, specify the path to the file that we're importing. And then we're building out here a term, and it's just a Kyandia message term, which is name, description, and a user ID. They're all just going to admin. And the name, we're pulling out the name, and then we're setting it to basic HTML because it's all ASCII. There's not really any HTML in it. And then we pull out the description. And then again, these are listed out here. It tells you what we get and what field in the source that actually comes from. And now that's all imported in. We've got a whole bunch of nodes and a whole bunch of terms. Again, we've got all of this kind of stuff: locations, items, messages, spells, levels. We're gonna have a quick look at what that looks like. So here are a bunch of locations. So if we come in and edit one of these locations, I've got all my field UI turned off, great. Here we have level 1 with an apprentice description. Level 12 is a red wizard. You know, we can look at messages, and then here are all of these kind of things that we saw before, like the help messages. So if we come into whatever ehint7 is and load that up. So this is something that an elf gives you a little hint, and whatever the message, the event fires in the system that specifies this particular message, this is the text that it pulls out to give to you. Now this still says cron, and it is cron, but it's not Drupal cron. In the original code for the BBS, every 8 seconds it runs a system cycle, and these cycles do all kinds of things within the game. Well, within the scope of the entire bulletin board, but in the game in particular, it either increments or decrements temporary effects. It will, eventually, like, it'll repopulate locations with items, it'll move monsters around, that kind of stuff. I don't know if you've ever tried to run DrupalCon every 8 seconds, but it is unhappy when you do that. So rather than try to run it through DrupalCron, I set up a free service at this cronjob.org, which lets me run every minute, which still slows it down. But since we don't have macros in Slack the way we used to do in Procom Plus or anything like that, this is fine enough to get you copy pasting and typing some of the speedy things that you need to do. And instead of running it through a cron hook, I now have a route that that runs the cleanup routines and the game timers. So to play the game, you type in text commands, and that's how you move around and look at things and talk to people, pick up objects, cast spells, gain levels. That's how you play the game. So you can check your inventory, you can move around. If there's a diamond on the floor, you can get it. You have something in your inventory, you can drop it. If there's a monster, you can beat it up. In order to make all of that happen and get this in a nice reusable format, we're using plugins to handle each of these commands. So we have an event listener that gets the command that's actually sent through Slack, whatever the player typed in. That handler then determines what kind of plugin it needs. It grabs an instance of that plugin and then performs the action. So let's talk about events first. We'll get to plugins in a moment. To fire an event in Drupal, in Symfony, it really looks like this. You need a custom event class that has some properties and things on it. The package I'm sending in there is the data package that we're getting from the Slack listener. Then we take our Slack event and give it to the event dispatcher with the type of event that we're looking for. And this is a constant declared in that Slack event class. The event dispatcher then fires that off, and then you have all the listeners that you set up that respond to that particular Slack event. And then each of the Slack events does things to that Slack event object. So it adds responses, it interacts with the properties, and variables on that particular Slack event class. And then when they're all done, the dispatcher sends that Slack event back to the caller here. And then we can pull the response out of this. And in this particular case, what we're looking for is something like maybe a 200 or something to send back to Slack. So there's a couple of messages that it does here, like when you set up your Slack application and put the endpoint in, the first thing it does is send a verification message with a challenge token, and then you have to immediately return that challenge token. So it handles that differently than just receiving a message. If you type in hi to your bot, all it needs is a 200 there. It doesn't need a challenge token back. So that's why it can set each one of these responses differently. And if it doesn't get one, there's more code down here that just gives a generic 200. But if you have something special that your event needs to do, it'll return it here. So here's what our event class looks like. This is that Slack event class, and we have that constant defined. So this is what your event listeners will look for when they're subscribing to the actual event. We have the response. That's this that we can return if we get one. We have on there the results, which contain text strings that are keyed by the player ID, so that our Slack API class can send them out to the appropriate players. All of that goes into this Slack event class. To set up a subscriber, you need to go into your module services.info.yaml file and then inherit an event subscriber interface. We're passing in the incoming Slack service, and then when we name it with an event subscriber, that's how Symfony knows to pass events into this, so that it knows what to listen for. When you set up your event subscriber class, you have to have this get subscribed events, and we can tell it that we're listening for this Slack event, and then we have a function defined called onSlackEvent, and it receives the Slack event class that we instantiated earlier as an argument. We can go then and specify these in a certain priority, and these descend, so you know, it'll run in your numeric order. So the listener, I hope this isn't too small to see. This is the function that we defined in our get subscribe events function. We get the event as a parameter, and now we can see what we're doing with it. So we have this the Slack package. This is the JSON request that comes in from Slack. And we're doing a couple of things on this. So here's that URL verification. The first time Slack interacts with your endpoint, it sends you this challenge parameter, which you then immediately have to return. That has to be returned within 3 seconds or it's invalid. It will try to hit that again. We also have here a listener for the app home opened event, which we can see there's some sort of Slack building blocks in here, which can return markdown text or their interactive components. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that it can do here. And this is handled here. So if we come to the home tab, we can see this is generated off of that. We modify this in this app home opened event. We come back to our home tab. There's our new text. So home has a whole bunch of stuff that you can do with it. Any sort of interactive Slack component you can put on here. We don't have we're just playing games. We don't have a real pressing need to put anything on here, but you can put on here whatever you like. Now let's start talking about these plugins. This is kind of where the magic happens here as far as interacting with the game. So let's talk about how to create custom plugins. In order to create a plugin, you need a plugin class, which defines your annotations. You need a plugin manager class, and then a plugin base class that tells all of your, all the plugins that you define how to work. So here's one of the ones that we have. We have this mud command plugin, and we're defining look. So here we have an ID, and then what module it goes to, and that's pretty much it for what we're doing here. In order to define these annotations, you're defining each of the properties in your plugin class. So here we have our ID, here we have our name, and then synonyms. Synonyms aren't working yet, but this is so that if maybe a synonym to look is examine, and then it would know to run the look plugin if you typed in examine instead of look, but that's not working yet. In your module, /src/annotation, that's where your actual plugin class lives. Now you need a plugin manager. This is mostly boilerplate. Once you've written one of these, you're just going to kind of copy paste this around. It doesn't do a whole lot, but what it does is pretty important. You have to tell it what your namespaces are. So here we're doing mud commands. And then you have to tell it the interface for what those plugins look like, the annotation, that plugin class that determines how you're declaring one of those plugins. You're setting up your alter info so that you can use Drupal's alter system to change any of the information here, and then you're setting any special caching. And this game in particular doesn't have any, but you can get super creative on how you're doing caching on each of these plugins. So this goes in the SRC directory in your module. It just kind of lives out there, and then this is what runs your plugins. So now we have our plugin interface. This is what each of the plugins the plugin classes is going to use to actually execute. So we only have one method, and that's perform, and it takes command text, which is the text to execute. It's whatever the player typed in. We have a node reference to whoever actually did the command, and then we have this results array, which is passed in by reference that everything that interacts with each of these perform methods adds stuff to. All of this is keyed by player. So here, player 1735 will get these two messages sent back to them. This player gets this message sent back to them. And the command can add as many results to this array as it wants for as many players as it wants. Again, if I execute a command where I leave one room and enter a new room, it has to alert everyone in the old room that I'm leaving and everyone in the new room that I'm arriving. So it has all of those players identified by their player ID and then each of the results that they are going to receive. We got oops, I think I'm skipping that. All right. Then we have a base class, which has some dependency injection and constructing stuff in here. Really, it's just to make everyone's life easier whenever you implement one of these plugin classes. So let's look at one. Here we have our Kyandia command plugin base, which extends from the generic, the Slack mud command plugin base. But since this is for this particular game, it needs a bunch of extra stuff. So we look at some of the dependency injection that we have. I don't know if this is big enough. Let me go into presentation mode. Now it might be too big. So we need an entity type manager because we need storage to pull things out of. The event dispatcher because some of these events can respond to other events. We have our word grammar service. Kyandia has a game handler, which lets us do things like pull out a user profile or a system that the game world itself has. And then it has the plugin manager for the mud commands themselves so that one command could chain multiple commands. For instance, again, using the example of leaving a room, if you leave a room and enter another room, it needs to return you the description of the new room. So that's effectively giving you a look command after you move. So it needs to be able to bring up another plugin and then get the results for that. So here's some of the things that it does, like these are some of the ported message handler routines. Like here's giving a result, a message back to you. And then the game handler has the routine to get the message. A special perform message, which which sends a different thing to the acting player so that it takes some arguments. Here you can send messages to multiple parties. So now every time I have a Kyandia plugin, it can now use all of these methods, and that makes things pretty easy. Okay, now this is the part that is really exciting. How do we integrate with Slack? I have a module called Slack Incoming. This is available up on Drupal.org right now. I went through all of the other Slack modules that were on Drupal.org already and didn't find that all of them could do anything that I needed to do. And what I really needed was I needed to accept messages, I needed to handle slash commands and fire off all the events that I needed, and I also needed them to authenticate. Slack has a token-based signing secret authentication method. We'll talk about that next. And then we also needed a Slack API to send out requests, like doing a chat.post message, which is what lets your bot send out text. And every time we see something like this, here if I type look, what it comes back with here, this is all the chat.post message. And views.publish, like, this is anytime you have an interactive surface, like when we're using the home tab, it sends out a views.publish API call. So I needed something that would both take in my messages, handle all of the events for those, and then send things back out. So it's actually Slack incoming, outgoing, but that was kind of long. Here's the URL where you can find this. This is up and live right now. So now let's talk about this authentication. We want to make sure that someone malicious or just random isn't sending weird stuff to your app pretending to be Slack. So since it has a signing secret, we have a form where we save that in config, and then we have an authentication provider to check that message, make sure that that it signs out correctly, validates that it actually comes from Slack and that it's been approved, and then it will allow it to go to the controller. So that's set up as a service, and it's this Slack incoming signing secret. And if you assign this Slack incoming signing secret to any route that's for slash commands or additional API handlers, which the API handlers for the most part you won't need, because the endpoint, this event endpoint, handles all of the event interactions that Slack will send you. But for things like slash commands, like here we can type /games, and then it will return me the list of games that we have. Those need to be authenticated as well. So for any one of those routes, you can put this Slack incoming signing secret on here, and then it will know to check each one of these. And anytime it gets an incoming request, if it doesn't match up with that signing secret, it won't go. So message behavior works more or less like this. So the user sends the bot a message. Then Slack sends our action endpoint a message. That authentication provider authenticates that it's real, and then the controller decodes that message, fires one of those Slack events, and then we have the event listeners, which process the message, generate the responses, and it has to generate a 200 response within 3 seconds, or it resends messages. So like if you have debugging turned on and you're doing this again through ngrok, maybe on a slow network, you can be debugging some sort of message that you're getting from Slack, and then it will send it multiple times in a row until it gets back a response. So that can be a little frustrating. And then our Slack events listeners use our Slack API service to call some of the Slack API messages, and then this is what we use to send a message back to the user. I see there's a comment in here about using the key module instead of saving the Slack token in config. That is true. By the time this gets to like some sort of production site and is not just my sort of messing around with it on my own, that's a good secure way to go. For the moment, it saves it into config, and then GitHub yells at me every time I push it, and then Slack makes me change the key because it's in a repository. There are a bunch of improvements that I would like to do to this, but this is all done in my off time, and it's a big system. So slash commands, this is like that /games that we just saw. You define that in your Slack application, and then that has to have a specific endpoint. So that needs a route in a controller method. And then we need to authenticate it. So the user sends their slash command. I type in /games. Slack sends that message to that particular endpoint, and then we authenticate it. And then the controller method reads that, does whatever it needs to do, and returns the response. And then Slack displays that response to the user. So this is a little bit different in that when we're receiving a message, like the player runs a command and then looks around, it is giving back a 200 for that, and then sending additional chat messages to display the text to the user. For a slash command, it has to return the payload in the response. So this the slash commands are handled a little bit differently. So to get this going on your own, create a Slack workspace. You go to slack.com/create, you sign up, confirm, describe your team. You enter all this stuff in, and then by the time you're done with that, you get this nice little Slack workspace. Then you can go to api.slack.com, register or log in, and when you click your apps, you can create this new application. So we created one D8 MUD presentation. We picked what workspace it was going to, and then when you continue, now you enter in all of your information and press Create App. And then it gives you a whole bunch of important stuff. So now we go to the Drupal site, and then we look at something that the Slack incoming module gives us. So we go to Configuration, Web Services, Slack, and now we enter in our signing secrets, the OAuth access token, and don't worry, these are about to be replaced. So if you're trying to spoof the site, you can only do that for about another hour. And then you can specify the base Slack API URL. There's no particular reason for this to change, but just in case it needs to, there is a place to change it. And you can save that. And that all comes from here. So here's our Slack app. And here's the credentials that it gives us. The signing secret is the important one. And then in OAuth, this OAuth bot token is also important. Those are the only two things you really need to get this integrated. Now we need to enable events and then set our endpoint URL. So there's an event subscriptions link in the features section, and then you have to turn that on. You type in the URL to your endpoint. So it defaults to Slack/action-endpoint, and I didn't see any particular reason to deviate from that. So Slack incoming's event handler is ///action endpoint. And here we have an ngrok URL, which points to this. Now, as soon as you enter this in, now it tries to give you that URL verification event where you have to return the challenge URL. And as soon as you do, then it comes back and it says verified, and now you can use that for every event interaction that you have with the site. So we have a whole bunch of events that we can subscribe to. I'm really only going to cover the ones that this app needs, and that's the app home opened, which is what gives us the home tab. And then we have message.im, and this is what handles the bots direct messages, and this is how the users all interact with the game. Everything they do is by interacting with the bot, which then figures out what it needs to send to other users. So there's not like a main channel that it monitors or everything. Everything is just done with direct messages with the bot. So once you've selected your permissions, or your events rather, you press Save Changes. And now we're going to generate some slash commands. So we have games and then join game. Games doesn't require a parameter, join game does. So we can create a new command. We have to set these up in our Slack MUD controller, and then we enter them into the Slack app configuration here. Here's what our routes look like. So we have /command/games. These are in the Slack MUD module, not in the Slack incoming module, because these are specific to this particular application. It's a post, and then we have our signing secret to true. And then we have join game. Here's its controller method, and then it also needs to be signed. So when we declare this, or define this, we're telling it it's /games. Here's the request URL, which again just points back to this. So it goes to /command/games. We have a description on it, and then it gives you a little preview of what the autocomplete will look like when the users are using it. And then same basic thing for join game. It has a little usage hint on here that we didn't define before because /games doesn't need a parameter. And then here's our little preview here. There are some settings that we need to set, and the scopes, and the scopes are pretty important. We need to add a scope that allows our module to message users. So we have to go to the OAuth and permissions and scroll down to scopes. And then here we have to add a scope to allow us to do a chat write. Now this is important. I have forgotten to do this on a handful of occasions when I've created apps, and I'm debugging and I'm looking like, why? Like, I'm getting my process. I have the log watchdog in here saying I got the message. Why isn't it writing out to the user? It's probably because you didn't specifically enable this chat::write scope. Make sure that you check this. If you are trying to send messages through Slack and they aren't appearing, first check your OAuth key, and that will probably be correct. And then check that you have enabled this scope, and then it should probably end up sending after that. We have another couple of ones here that we don't actually need, like, I don't need an IM history or the, direct message history, but they all come with whatever we were doing here. The commands in the chat.write one, or chat::write are the important ones. So we need to make sure we add that bot OAuth token. That's the one I showed you a minute ago. And then you have to copy that into your Slack incoming settings and click save. And then, if you're trying to be secure, use the key module. If you're just being lazy like I was, save it to config. And then you can install it to your workspace. So it's going to verify that you want to allow it to do all these things. We say yes. And now, when we go back to our workspace, here we can see that it's in here. We can test the commands, and they all work. So this game was pretty complicated. It's got dozens and dozens, I don't know if it has hundreds or not, of commands that the user can type and different interactions. And again, it has different processes if you do something in one location versus a different location. So it needed a lot of testing. And I decided to do that with Behat. Kernel tests would have been something else to do, but for every command that we're testing, like there's so much mocking, and we're testing actual data output, and to make sure that all of our sprintf tokens are all in the right spot and have the things that they needed. So we really needed some behavior testing, and it was so much faster to write this stuff out with Behat once the app was set up, and make that all work. And that looks something like this. I'll just let this run for a bit. There's, I think, a couple of thousand steps, and they do all pass. And then there's a bunch of manual testing in Slack. Slack also has an API tester tool called Steno, which I'm not super familiar with, but it might be able to help things like debugging those interactive components when their tokens are in danger of expiring. But again, I haven't really gotten into it. So everything that I showed you here is in GitHub. You can find that at tiny.cc/slackmud. The slides are up on the presentation, on the session page at mid.camp/6280. You can leave feedback there as well. The Slack incoming module is on Drupal.org, so is word grammar. SlackMud and Kyandia are not. I don't actually own the source code that I've ported, so I don't know the licensing around all of that stuff. So maybe it'll end up there, maybe not, but you can get it all in GitHub. So I can take questions now.
You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or we can start in the chat channel, however you want to let us know.
Oh, I see Benji raise a hand.
All right. Trying to find you to unmute you, Benji. There you go. You should be able to talk, Benji.
This is nice. We won't have to repeat questions now for the recording. I can't hear you, though.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
With all that C code you had to port, I wonder, were you able to automate some of that, or did you have to just do it manually, one function at a time?
Yeah, I pretty much had to do it manually, one function at a time. And, like some of the mistakes we often make in porting. I tried to do some optimization and apply some better principles to some of that code, and realized just how long that was taking, and then how much translation it took from the old code to the new code, which is why I ended up implementing some of those handling methods like the U message and the perf message, because that's what the old code used. So I sort of reverted back to its own paradigm in order to speed up those, that porting. But yeah, it was by hand for every one of those.
Wow.
But it's a labor of love. Like, I spent so much time playing this game, again, 30 years ago, that seeing how it all comes together and how it's all done, like I didn't realize how some of the stuff worked. Some of the text that it would display, those are long paragraphs, and they're very descriptive and fantasy-ish, and there's a lot in them. And I didn't realize when I was playing the game that they all had the same token setup. So it was the first string in there was always the character name. The second string in there was always your possessive, so his or her, and then there was an optional third one, which was a him or her. And when you go through the messages, importing them and touching them by hand, you can see that they all do follow that pattern. But when you're playing the game and they're all different messages, you couldn't really see that that's the way it was. It was cool to see how it all went together. For 1990, this was pretty good, solid code.
And for the migration, was all of that text in one file, or did you have to import a whole bunch of different files?
Yeah, there were a handful of files.
Like one for locations and one for actions or something like that?
Yeah, it needed each of these. So there were a bunch of game level. Oh, that was my actual game. I have an error in here where it's not determining one of the dependencies. So since you could actually have multiple Slack mode games in here, so they each have a game record. So I have to import this first. I haven't gone in to check why. But once that's done, then you can do items. And these like items have multiple files in them just on their own. So here we have their item ID and then the name and then the description. They could potentially have a description for what happens if you try to interact with them and you can't. And then if it's visible or if you can pick it up. And then let's see, where is it? Yeah, in some of these files, that's where the actual item description text goes. So they're declared in different ways, and then like these are location texts, and they have IDs that get keyed off of these. So yeah, it was a complex migration.
And are all of these text files open source?
They're in GitHub.
Okay.
Again, it's 30-year-old code. I don't know what the actual licensing, the licensing for it is, but all of this is available in that GitHub repository that I put the link up for.
I guess I wonder if it would make sense to do a one-time conversion from those custom text formats into XML or JSON or something, and then instead of writing a custom migration source plugin, just use something standard. And
yeah, I did look at doing it that way, but I wanted to also do it as a mostly Drupal solution and show how you can do complex migrations to get all this stuff in. Because I was looking at importing some other games, like having a ZIL interpreter that could play things like Zork or Planetfall or any of those old Infocom games, and their format is yet different. So if there's if I have to translate it just to import it, and I would have to have multiple translations just to import them, I may as well just import them.
cool.
Any more questions? All right. Well, I really did expect more. When we're in person, there's usually a lot more interaction, a lot more questions than this. Can I talk about migration? What do you want to know more specifically? This is something that came in through chat, so I'm just reading this out.
I can unmute if
Oh yeah,
you're
please.
interested. Let me, Irina, you are now unmuted.
Hi,
Feel free to
everyone.
talk.
It's very interesting to do camp completely online first time. I wanted to ask about comments. Like it seems like you had to do a lot of migrations from very old files.
Oh yeah.
So I would love to hear what tools made it easier, what would be better, what would be easier for you if you would do it again, what tools would you like to have?
I am pretty happy with the way that I did it. So if I were to do it again, I would just have a slightly optimized version of what it is that I did here. We can see that we've got a couple of groups. We've got some migrations in here. Like if we look at locations, there's a couple of things here I'm doing. We set locations get saved as a node, not as a term. So our fields are a little bit different than the one that I showed before. We store things like, where's a brief description here, default items. So like, the game sets so that in this particular location, it should always start out with these items in it. So, these have a dependency on the actual items, and then they have to look those up. I did end up doing 2 sources to handle this LCS versus an MSG. I would probably standardize this because they're very similar formats. But really, it was just writing these couple of sources and a handful of processes, which, some of them just do very slightly more complex functions than is easy to do in a migration configuration. Some of them are more complex. This is pulling a description out of a different file based on a record in the source file. Here we're checking on something if it's different. Like I think Migrate Plus comes with something to check if something is the same, but doesn't really give you a flow to do something if it's different. Just a couple of things. Again, here's something else to pull out. This was an early iteration of it, pulling a description out from a different file. I could refactor this and make them all use the same mechanism now, but I didn't make a whole lot of time to go back and do that because it was all working.
Cool, very cool. Well, this is a very interesting use of kind of Drupal for fun things. So this is very exciting to see how highly technical things end up in very fun results.
Thanks, yeah. And speaking of Drupal for fun, make sure you talk to Irina later on if you want to contribute to Feeds Migrate, which is putting all of this Drupal 8 migrate stuff into a feeds context to put a nice UI and scheduling around it. It's a very cool project that I haven't been able to contribute enough to, but it's worth doing.
Jack, thank you so much for all your kind words. I hope that you will have some time on Saturday to join Sprint, at least for a little bit, just to say hello.
Okay. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. Any other questions about this? I'm gonna look at Slack, the Zoom chat for another few seconds, just in case somebody's typing. Okay, I don't see anything. So you can get me on the MidCamp Slack or on Drupal Slack. My Drupal username is FranksJ, and I'd be more than happy to go through all of this with you. The project has a little README on how to get it going if you're going to pull it down here. And like I said, let me know if you have any questions or want to talk about Slack integration anymore. You can get word grammar and Slack incoming on Drupal.org right now and start playing with those. So create some Slack apps, do some cool stuff, and then show it to me. All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.